my sample form number 123, and you can see here I already have a question for my students, and it is, who is your homeroom teacher? And this leads me into the first feature that I want to show you, and that's a feature called Go to Section Based on Answer. Now, I have written out this question of who is your homeroom teacher? And before I add another question, what I'm going to do is add a section for Mr. Burns students, Mrs. Smith students, and Mr. Bob's students. So I'm going to do that in the bottom right corner. I'll select Add Section, and we'll set this up to be Mr. Burns students. And then I'm going to add another section, and that section is going to be called Mrs. Smith's students. And one more section, and we'll call it Mr. Bob's students. Now, this question I want to bring back up to the top. And I'm going to make this first question required. And now I'm going to enable Go to Section Based on Answer. And in this case, we'll say Go to Section Based on Answer for Mr. Burns class. Well, we'll go to the section called Mr. Burns students. Mrs. Smith, that'll line up to Mrs. Smith, and Mr. Bob, they'll line up to Mr. Bob. Now, I can add questions to each one of these sections, and I'll do that right now. Let's add a fun little question here. Let's add in a little multiple choice question. Let's say, what is the tallest mountain in the world? And it'll give a couple of options. And there we are. Now, what's really important here is that rather than selecting go to next section, we're going to say submit the form. Otherwise, when Mr. Burns students are done, they'll have to go on and take the questions from Mrs. Smith and Mr. Bob students that appear after that. So that's Go to Section Based on Answer. Now let's open up a new form, and let me show you some other features that you can use. Let's make a blank form again. And in this next section, let's set up some preferences for our quizzes that we might give in a Google form. So we'll just call this one Sample Quiz number 125. And let's set our preferences so that we don't forget to give point values or to make a question required. So this upper right corner, we'll select Preferences, and we'll select Make Questions Required so that our kids can't skip a question. And we'll set a default point value. You can do 5, 10, or even 0 if you want, or anything in between. And now, when I write our questions, they're going to have a default point value. Maybe my question will be something along the lines of, who was the first president of the United States? Let's say Washington, Jefferson, or Adams. Now, we haven't made this into a quiz yet. In the upper right corner, let's make sure it's quizzes, make this a quiz, and save those answers. So now we have our default value of 10 points up there in the upper right-hand corner because we have one question and it's worth 10 points. And by default, it's a required question for all of my students. That's a handy little way to make sure you never forget to give a point value for a quiz. Now, at the end of the quiz, a little trick or a little tip that I've used for years is here in this presentation field. When students are done with the quiz, I'm going to turn off this show link to submit another response.